Hello there. Welcome to my story about my encounter and survival against the feared beast of the forest, a tale from an average hiking trip to a survival story against the forces of nature. Let's get on to the video. And also, this video will include all three parts of the story mentioned before. Part 1, the hiking trip. We stepped off of the plane at the Tadul Lake Airport in northern Manitoba and onto tarmac crusty with ice and snow. We unloaded our backpacks and guns from the chartered plane in the perpetual twilight of the far northern latitudes. The sun, already dipping behind silhouetted tiger in the late afternoon. We piled our bags into the back of a 4x4 streaked with muddy ice. It was me, my brother-in-law Jeremy, and his friend Red. We were to meet our Chipewyan guide that evening at the lodge. Jeremy and Red were both corporate lawyers in New York, and my wife suggested I join them on their winter hunting trip to get to know them better. I didn't want to get to know Jeremy and Red. They were assholes, but she thought if I spent more time with her brother, I might learn to like him. In her grief, she refused believe me when I returned home weeks later and told her I'd seen her brother eat his best friend alive in the northern Canadian woods. We arrived at the large timber lodge after a bumpy jeep ride, Jeremy and Red talking old hunting stories, admiring each other's expensive LL Bean jackets, and bitching about the 2 caribou limit on their hunting permits. They interjected jabs at me, subtly disparaging my line of work, the size of my bank account, amongst other things, and my inexperience with shooting animals in the wilderness, saying they would make a man out of me this week. The lobby was empty this late in the season, and we had no trouble finding our guide Akaitcho at the bar. Much to my disgust and Jeremy's amusement, Akaitcho was already drunk on well whiskey, and my doubts about this trip were multiplied. Should I stay behind at the lodge, let the boys hunt while I took the shittiest week's vacation in recorded history? I would never live it down, and every Thanksgiving I would suffer the retelling of how I stayed behind while the men ventured forth to battle nature herself. Jeremy and Red went to their rooms soon after the sun went down, after getting sufficiently drunk themselves, and I stayed behind with Akaitcho in front of the fire. He was still drinking whiskey. I had a mug of decaf. I never understand you white people, Akaitcho said unexpectedly. He was taciturn while the others laughed at his inebriation and his short stature. Jeremy played lacrosse in college. He was a beast. You pay thousands, hand thousands to freeze your dicks off for a week. Why not come in August? It's beautiful here in August. Not so dangerous, I'm not too thrilled to go out there myself, Akaitcho grunted in response. The building was all but empty of visitors, the staff was scarce, and the shadows encroached from hallways and corners. Outside it was snowing. We sat in front of the fireplace for a while longer in silence until Akaitcho broke it again like crunchy ice. Do you know about the Wendigo? His voice had dropped in volume and pitch to a throaty rumble. He placed his empty glass on the floor beside his chair. No. Is it like Chinook winds or something? Ha! He barked, and a log shifted on the fire, throwing sparks. No, not weather, but ancient like the winds. My people tell of a demon in the woods, the Wendigo. It has not been seen for many years. Fad and habits men, drives them mad, uses them like puppets to satiate itself. So it's like a campfire story. Maybe you should tell it some night. I'd love to see Jeremy piss his pants out in the woods. No story. I don't mention the Wendigo out there. And your brother, he is the type the Wendigo seeks. I tell you this to give you fair warning. The nights have been cold, and the aurora has been lively. These are the conditions the beast favors. Wait, you're just pulling my leg. Scare the white guy before his trip sort of thing. There isn't such thing as a windy whatever it is. The stories don't reach you in the far south. Murder, cannibalism, the forest keeps its secrets. It hides the blood we know, Chipewyan know, but suit yourself. He rose and left me alone in the drafty lodge. The next morning we rose early and packed our gear onto snowmobiles. Akaitcho led us from the wide clearing around the lodge to a path that wound its way through the woods. We were all covered head to toe, but still the wind was biting through my layers. I wondered if Jeremy and Red's fancy jackets kept them much warmer. That first night we made camp in a meadow and gathered around a fire while Akaitcho prepared a simple meal. Red produced a flask and passed it between himself and Jeremy. He offered it to me and I declined. earning a chuckle from Jeremy before he took the final swig. Above us, the aurora danced like green ribbons in the sky. Akaitcho looked up and raised his eyebrows at me before retiring to his tent. "So you and the Eskimo guy buddies?" Red asked. "You going to have some Northwoods romance or something?" Jeremy laughed. "No, we just talked last night after you two went to bed. Ah, so just pillow talk, I get it." "Yeah, sure." I sat poking the fire for a long minute. He told me about some legend his people have, about some demon called the Wendigo. "Oh, spooky," Jeremy said and laughed again. He really believes in it, apparently. He says that it possesses people out in the woods, makes them kill each other. Sounds like a load of bullshit. Probably told you because he thought you were the easiest target. "Sounds like it worked too," Red said. More laughter. "Probably. Right, I'm going to bed. I was sick of them already." About midnight, my tent shook violently and Jeremy stuck his head, face illuminated by flashlight from below, through the zippered flap, while Red snickered out of view. "Hoo-hoo," Jeremy went on with a terrible Dracula accent. "It is I, the Windy Woo. Oh, come to suck your blood." Red was hysterical. I rolled over and ignored them. That night the winds picked up, the temperature continued to drop, and the aurora danced. And that's the end of part 1. Now moving on to part 2 of the story, and thank you for listening so far. The next day we packed up camp and headed out again on the snowmobiles. We didn't see a single caribou and Jeremy began complaining. "This is a rip-off if you ask me. I knew we should have gone to our usual spot, but my brat of a sister suggests here because it was easier for him to get here from Chicago." He jabbed a thumb in my direction. We had stopped and set up camp again, and we were scouting for caribou. Akaitcho was out in front when Jeremy turned to Red and whispered, "I don't know about you, but I'm not paying this snowspick a dime if we don't get at least $3 apiece." Suddenly our guide stopped and listened, holding up his hand for us to be quiet. A panting noise was coming from the trees to our left, and Akaitcho led the way between them. We began to notice blood staining the snow. We came into a clearing and saw a wolf curled beneath a tree. I stammered back into Red and was prepared to run until I noticed the trail of blood led to the animal and that its viscera lay on the snow before it. Between its panting, it would bury its snout in its guts and devour bits of itself. "I'm going to be sick," Red said as he turned to leave the clearing to puke behind a tree. Akaitcho raised his gun, and the disgusting sounds of the wolf eating itself stopped with an ear-splitting crack as he shot the animal in the head. "This is a bad sign," Akaitcho said, almost angry, but mostly terrified. "I heard you last night. I heard you speak of the Wendigo, and now he is here, I'm certain." The wind picked up, shaking the trees surrounding us. We followed Akaitcho back to the camp where he retired to his tent without another word. The long gloaming was deepening already. We prepared our own meals that evening and went to bed without much discussion. When we woke up, Akaitcho's tent and snowmobile were gone. "What a goddamn disaster," Jeremy roared. "We never should have trusted that drunk Eskimo." "Maybe we should go back," Red suggested. "Get another guide and do it right." "I agree with Red," I said. "No one cares what you think," Jeremy shot back. "You're just spooked. By some lame ghost story, your opinion doesn't count. Look, we haven't even seen any caribou." Red was more sober-minded since Akaitcho's departure than I'd ever seen him. "The only animal we've seen out here was that disgusting wolf. I don't even hear any birds for Christ's sakes." "Fine. If I'm outnumbered by the bitch patrol, then let's go on back and call the whole week a wash." Jeremy threw his gun on the ground in frustration and jumped backward when it discharged. I instinctively covered my head and closed my eyes, and when I opened them, Red was screaming on the snow, holding his left leg below the knee. Jeremy stared wide-eyed. I approached in disbelief before snapping back to reality and quickly stuffing my gloved hands over the bullet wound. "Oh God, oh God, oh God," was all Red was saying, over and over, as I took off my belt and tied a tourniquet above the wound, on his calf. Jeremy was sitting on a log nearby, silent, hands on his head, as barely coherent as the friend he inadvertently shot. Red's leg was mess, the size of a grapefruit and shooting bright red arterial blood onto the snow. "Jeremy," I said. No response. "Jeremy," I yelled. He looked over at Red and me. "We need to load him up on a snowmobile and get moving back to the lodge. We're only 2 days out. We can get back in time to save his leg." The bleeding had slowed to an ooze, but Red needed a physician quickly. Jeremy moved as in a fog and helped me sit Red on my snowmobile. We hastily threw our supplies together and looked around the clearing until we found Akaitcho's snowmobile tracks and began following them. We rode for hours, following the faint lines through the snow our guide left, quickly fading now that flurries were blowing through the trees. "This can't be right," Jeremy said, his first words since shooting Red. "None of this is familiar. We didn't come this way." "Of course we did. Why wouldn't Akaitcho go back to the lodge?" I asked. "The sun has been behind us all day. We're going farther north." "Shit! That would have been nice to know a few hours ago, Jeremy." "Are you kidding me?" Red exclaimed. "We're going the wrong way. Oh God, I'm going to die out here because of you. Because of me." Jeremy exploded out of his fog. "If it weren't for my sister, we'd be in Newfoundland like every other year. If he didn't come with us. Stop it, both of you." It turned out that I would have to be the adult that got us out of this mess. "The sun is going down. Red isn't bleeding anymore, but he can't be exposed out in the cold overnight. I say we set up camp here and go back the way we came in the morning." We built a fire, and I carved a blaze on a tree so we would know in the morning which way we came. I left Jeremy and Red at the camp, and, with what little light was left over the horizon, I followed Akaitcho's tracks further to see if he was camped up ahead. A few hundred yards beyond our camp, the trees broke, and I emerged in a wide, empty meadow. A few dozen feet beyond the trees, Akaitcho's snowmobile tracks stopped. I searched all around where they ended and found no other tracks or footprints. I stood in the freezing cold, the wind whistling through the trees behind me, staring across the meadow at dusk. A chill ran up my arms and neck, and I quickly turned and headed back to camp. When I got back, I claimed that Akaitcho's tracks became obscured amongst the trees. I kept the truth of what I saw to myself. If we made it back to the lodge, we would send help for our guide, but I doubted there would be anything left of him to find. I began to believe the campfire stories. And that's part 2 of the story. Thank you so much for staying this far. Now let's move on to part 3. We all slept in one tent for warmth. Jeremy tossed and turned all night, waking me on multiple occasions. I went out about midnight to urinate and saw the green aurora overhead. I felt the extreme cold as the temperature continued to fall over. Night. My breath hung in a cloud well after I went back into the tent. I awoke again a few hours later, freezing cold wind whipping the open flap of the tent, and Jeremy gone. Red was shivering, awake, wide-eyed in the far corner of the tent. "Where'd Jeremy go?" I asked, whispering despite our isolation. Red just shook his head no and drew a sleeping bag around his cowering form. My heart began to pound inside my ribcage. I put on my boots, grabbed a rifle and a flashlight, and went out into the night. The aurora was still overhead, the moon a faint sliver through the trees. I saw Jeremy's footprints leading away from the tent, heading north between Akaitcho's faded tracks. I followed them once again through the woods until I came to the meadow. Jeremy's boot prints continued past the snowmobile lines that stopped abruptly but began appearing at wider intervals as if he had been running. Jeremy was much bigger than me, but I was soon requiring 3 steps for every one of his left in the snow. The space between footprints continued to expand. 10 feet, 12 feet. The final 2 boot prints were 20 feet apart and ended in the middle of the meadow, the faint fog of breath still hanging in the frigid air. Jeremy, like Akaitcho, had disappeared. I gripped the rifle tightly in one hand and the flashlight in the other, and began walking as quickly as the snow allowed, back toward our camp. The wind had ceased and a deathly calm descended on the forest. When I arrived at our clearing, my stomach fell out beneath me. Our tent was in shambles, canvas torn and poles snapped and poking out in all directions. Red was nowhere to be seen. The snowmobiles were parked where we left them, but neither engine turned over. The snow showed no sign of tracks or a struggle, as I sat on a broken snowmobile, shivering in the subarctic cold and wondering how I would survive the night. I heard a familiar panting noise from the trees behind me. I turned and pointed my flashlight at the shadows and saw the green flicker of animal eyes. The same wolf as before, intestines steaming and hanging beneath it in the snow, whimpered and loped off into the woods. For some unknown reason, I felt a compulsion to follow. The wolf stayed within view, stopping when I fell behind, and led me on for what seemed like hours. The moon never moved from overhead, and the aurora kept dancing, as I followed my new guide, using the ruby-red drops of blood it left behind as breadcrumbs through the trees. I lost sight of the wolf, and when I followed the blood I came to another smaller meadow with a single trees, blackened and hollowed by fire, standing in the middle. The sky was dazzling green and reflected off the fresh snow that was beginning to fall. I approached meadow cautiously, rifle held before me toward the entrance through the trees. As I got closer, I began to hear sloppy noises and the occasional crunch, intermingled with dampened screams and moans and the intense thumping of my heart. I shined my light in the tree and saw red, eyes closed and barely conscious, head falling. To the side, mouth open and stuffed with twigs and dirt and pine needles, unable to speak, arms bound behind him. Jeremy was hunched over Red's legs. I fired the rifle at Jeremy, and the bullet cracked into the tree behind him. My brother-in-law's body rose from his friend's mutilated legs. He was naked, except for a caribou carcass draped about his shoulders, head and antlers resting upon his own filthy hair. Gone were his powerful muscles and shoulders, and his skin seemed to hang from unnaturally long limbs. His face was his own, but gaunt and smeared with the blood and bits of his best friend. His chest was covered in ancient runes cut into his flesh. In his left hand he held Red's meatless tibia. He opened his mouth wide, his jaw seemingly unhinged, and let out a horrendous scream. The sound of many tortured voiced rose from his gullet, high-pitched and painful. I closed my eyes and fired the rifle again. The .300 Magnum round found its mark on Jeremy's chest, and I heard his body crumple against the burned-out tree. I rushed forward and dragged Red by the arms a dozen yards away. Jeremy lay where I shot him in the hollowed-out tree. I bent down and began pulling dirt and debris from Red's mouth before realizing he was not responsive. His legs were missing from the knee down, blood staining the snow, and his face was sickly green, reflecting the aurora off its pale whiteness. I felt for a pulse, but there was none. When I looked up, Jeremy's body was gone. I left Red's corpse and ran back through the trees, trying to remember the way I came. I spent rounds firing into the woods at lanky forms, real or imagined, and heard the Wendigo scream in the distance behind me as I ran. I made it back to our camp and collapsed in the snow in front of our snowmobiles. The wind was whipping through the trees once again, and I held the rifle up before me, pointing into the woods where I had just emerged. The smaller of the trees began to shake, and the sound of breaking branches and crunching snow came closer. I closed my eyes and pulled the trigger again, but the rifle was out of ammunition. When I opened them again, I saw a half-dozen flashlights amongst the trees. I dropped the rifle and ran forward into a group of hunters who were drawn by the frantic firing of a gun, telling them we needed to leave the area, that I was being chased by the Wendigo. They thought I was insane and looked around in awe at our destroyed camp. They took me back through the woods to their own camp, and over the next 2 days drove me back to the lodge. Red and Jeremy's bodies were never recovered. A search party spent days scouring the area we had been in. They found the destroyed camp and attributed it to bears. They attributed my story of the Wendigo to post-traumatic stress. Before they flew me down to Winnipeg to be seen at the hospital, I remembered our guide, Akaitcho. I told them he too was missing, and that they needed to find him, or his corpse. The ranger I told this to gave me a skeptical look and walked me back into the lodge and pointed across the room to the bar. Seated with a tumbler of whiskey before him was Akaitcho. He seemed to be in conversation with a group of young men in expensive hunting gear. He turned to me, a smile barely marking the corner of his mouth, and raised his eyebrows knowingly before turning back to the bar. Well, that's the end of the story. Thank you so much for listening throughout it. Credits to the story The Wendigo by C.W. Thornton on the Bandar blog.